Jake Bennett had seen a lot of strange things in his 15 years working interstellar mining operations, but nothing quite prepared him for the lower levels of Station Kepler 9. The station was old, really old, built back when humans were still figuring out how to work alongside the dozen other species that made up the Galactic Consortium. Most of the facility hummed with activity, but the lower sections had been sealed off for longer than anyone could remember. The alien crew refused to go down there. When Jake first asked about the sealed sectors during his orientation, the reaction was immediate and unsettling. The bug-like Vex workers clicked their mandibles nervously and scattered like startled insects. The crystalline Luxari, normally so talkative and helpful, simply turned away without a word. Even his supervisor Tross, a towering reptilian who stood nearly 8 feet tall and feared nothing, had pulled Jake aside with an unusual urgency in his voice. "Stay away from the sealed sectors, human," Tross had warned, his scales darkening with what Jake had learned to recognize as genuine concern. "There are things down there best left undisturbed. Old things. Dangerous things." But Jake was the new foreman, brought in specifically to oversee the expansion project. The station needed more space, more facilities, and the lower levels were the only option that made economic sense. Someone had to go down there and survey the area, figure out what could be salvaged and what needed to be demolished. The job fell to Jake, and he'd never been one to shy away from a challenge just because some folks got spooked. So down he went, hard hat secured, heavy-duty flashlight in hand, cutting through 3 centuries of accumulated dust and darkness. The air down here was stale but breathable, filtered by the station's ancient life support systems that somehow still functioned despite being forgotten. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that danced in his flashlight beam. The walls were covered in some kind of corrosion, and several times Jake had to climb over collapsed support beams and piles of debris. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Up on the main levels there was always noise, the hum of machinery, the chatter of workers, the constant vibration of mining equipment. Down here, there was only silence and the echo of his own footsteps. That's when he found it. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, easily the size of a football field. Jake swept his flashlight across the space, and at first he thought he was looking at a collapsed wall or maybe some kind of geological formation. A massive mound of gray-brown rock and debris filled the center of the chamber, rising at least 40 feet high. Strange angular shapes jutted out at odd angles, some that looked almost like they could be wings or massive limbs, but covered in so much accumulated grime that it was impossible to tell. Jake stepped closer, his boots crunching on the debris-covered floor. Something felt off about this. The shape was too organic, too deliberate to be a random collapse. He approached the mound carefully, reaching out to touch what he thought was a boulder. The surface was warm. Then the mound shifted. Dust cascaded down like a waterfall, filling the air with a choking cloud. Jake stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. 2 enormous eyes opened in what he had mistaken for a boulder, each one the size of a dinner plate. They were dull and yellowed with age, but they focused on him with an intelligence that was unmistakable. "Holy hell," Jake breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The creature's voice came through his translator as a dry rasp, like stone grinding against stone, crackling with centuries of disuse. "Leave, human. There is nothing here for you. Only duty and darkness." Jake's first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct he'd developed over 15 years in dangerous environments screamed at him to get out of there. But his engineer's mind was already working, already analyzing what he was seeing. This wasn't a monster preparing to attack. This was something alive, something clearly intelligent, and something that was suffering. The creature was buried under what looked like 3,000 years of neglect, grime, and decay. Jake forced himself to stay calm, to think. "What are you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. There was a long pause, as if the creature was surprised anyone would ask. "I am Zrakos, guardian of the vault. I have held my post for 3 millennia. Now leave me to my duty." Jake walked around the massive form, his flashlight revealing more details with each step. Beneath the layers of mineral deposits, rust, and accumulated filth, he could make out the shape of a creature of immense size. What might have once been scales were now crusted over with corrosion. Joints appeared seized with calcification. The stench of infection hung heavy in the stagnant air, making Jake's eyes water. "When's the last time anyone checked on you?" Jake asked, pulling out his tablet and starting to take notes and photos. A long silence stretched between them. Then the creature spoke again, and Jake could hear something in that ancient voice. "Sadness, maybe. Or resignation. The last of my masters died 2,847 years ago." Jake stopped walking, his tablet frozen in his hands. "Nearly 3,000 years. This being had been down here alone for nearly 3,000 years. And nobody's been down here since? Why would they? The creature's voice held no bitterness, only a tired acceptance. I am a monster guarding dead things in the dark. I am a relic of a forgotten age. My purpose is solitude. Jake looked up at those tired, ancient eyes. He'd worked with a lot of different species over the years, and he'd learned to read emotion in faces very different from human ones. What he saw in Zrakasa's eyes hit him harder than he'd expected. Loneliness. Resignation. This wasn't a monster. This was someone who'd been abandoned and forgotten, left to suffer in the darkness while life went on above. Jake Bennett had always been a practical man. He fixed problems. That's what humans did best, wasn't it? They saw something broken and they figured out how to fix it. They saw someone in trouble and they helped. It didn't matter if that someone was human or alien or apparently an ancient dragon that everyone else was too scared to approach. He looked at the creature, then at his tablet full of notes and photos, and made a decision that would change everything. Well, Jake said, his voice firm with determination, already forming a plan in his mind, that's about to change. Jake called the meeting for the next morning, giving himself just enough time to compile his evidence and prepare his argument. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. The alien species on the station had avoided those lower levels for centuries, and convincing them to let him go back down there, let alone help the creature, was going to take every bit of persuasion he had. The conference room erupted in chaos the moment he finished his opening statement. Absolutely not. Tross hissed, his scales flaring from their usual green to an angry red. He rose from his seat, his full 8-foot height imposing in the cramped conference room. The Guardian is not to be disturbed. This is madness. It's sacred, the Luxari representative chimed in, her crystalline body literally chiming with agitation, creating a musical discord that filled the room. An ancient oathkeeper should not be tortured. Jake interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. Because that's what's happening down there. That's what's been happening for 3,000 years while everyone pretended it wasn't their problem. He pulled up the images on the main screen and several of the alien representatives actually recoiled. The close-ups were brutal and graphic. Infected tissue oozing and raw. Scales that had fused with metal debris, creating painful amalgamations of flesh and rust. Joints seized with mineral buildup so severe that movement must have been agony. This creature has been suffering for 3,000 years, Jake said quietly, letting the images speak for themselves. And everyone just walked away. Everyone just assumed it was fine down there in the dark. The Vex administrator, a particularly pompous individual named Kretch, clicked his mandibles and what Jake had learned was their version of dismissive laughter. It is a guardian human. It chose its fate. It swore an oath. This is the way of such things. Did it? Jake leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. Did it really choose this? Or did everyone just assume it was fine being abandoned when the civilization it served died out? He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each representative. When's the last time any of you went down there? When's the last time anyone asked if it needed help? The silence was damning. No one answered. Jake switched to a thermal image, the colors bright and alarming against the dark background. Look here. These hot spots aren't just warm. They're infections. Active ones. This being is running a constant fever, fighting off who knows how many different bacterial and fungal infections. It's in constant pain and it's still doing its job. Still guarding whatever's in that vault. He paused, letting that sink in. That deserves respect, not neglect. Beth Carter, the station administrator and the only other human in the room, studied the images carefully. She was in her late 40s, sharp as a tack, and had a reputation for being fair but tough. She'd worked with Jake for 5 years, ever since he'd transferred to Kepler 9, and she'd learned to trust his judgment even when his ideas seemed crazy. What are you proposing, Bennett? She asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. Let me take a team down there. Clean it up. Treat the infections. Basic maintenance. Jake clicked to the next slide, showing equipment lists and estimated costs. I'm not talking about anything complicated. Industrial cleaners, medical supplies, maybe some scaffolding to reach the higher areas. Just give the creature some basic care. Why? Tross demanded, his scales still flared in agitation. What purpose does this serve? The Guardian has survived for 3 millennia. Why intervene now? Jake shrugged, a very human gesture that he knew the aliens found confusing. Because it's the right thing to do. Look, I get that different species have different values, but where I come from, you don't leave someone suffering when you can help. It's that simple. He paused, then added, and because if that dragon. Dragon? Several voices interrupted at once, in several different languages that the translator struggled to keep up with. Yeah, dragon. Jake pulled up a comparison chart he'd spent half the night creating. If you look at the skeletal structure based on what I could see under all that grime, it matches old Earth myths pretty closely. 4 legs, wings, long neck, the works. We had stories about creatures like this before we even left our planet. He switched back to the thermal image. Anyway, if Zrakas is in constant pain, it's not performing its guardian duties effectively. A healthy guard is a better guard. This isn't just compassion, it's practical. Beth tapped her fingers on the table, a habit she had when she was thinking hard about something. The sound echoed in the quiet room. She'd worked with Jake long enough to recognize the set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes. She knew that look. You've already decided to do this, haven't you? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jake grinned, that boyish smile that made him look younger than his 42 years. I'm just asking for the equipment budget. And maybe some volunteers from the crew who don't mind getting their hands dirty. Beth sighed, a long, tired sound. She looked at the images again, then at the cost estimates, then back at Jake. Fine. But this comes out of your department's maintenance allocation. You're not getting extra funding for this pet project. She fixed him with a hard stare, the kind that had made more than one worker reconsider their life choices. And Bennett? This dragon better not eat any of my crew. I've got enough paperwork without adding, consumed by ancient guardian, to someone's incident report. Yes, ma'am, Jake said, trying to keep the triumph out of his voice. Tross stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is foolishness. Human foolishness. You will regret disturbing the guardian. He stalked out of the room, his tail lashing in anger. The other representatives filtered out more slowly, some shaking their heads, others muttering in their native languages. Crutch clicked something that the translator rendered as typical human arrogance before scuttling away. Only Beth remained. She looked at Jake for a long moment. You really think you can help it? I think I have to try, Jake said simply. Beth nodded slowly. That's what I like about you humans. You see a problem and you just can't leave it alone. Most species would have filed a report and forgotten about it. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Be careful down there, Jake. And keep me updated. I want daily reports. You got it. As the door closed behind her, Jake was already pulling out his phone, texting his team. He'd need Mike from engineering, Amy and Tyler from the mining crew, Rachel from medical. They'd need industrial pressure washers, chemical degreasers, pneumatic tools for the really tough buildup, medical supplies for the infections, scaffolding to reach the higher areas. And they'd need patience. A lot of patience. But if there was one thing humans were good at, it was tackling impossible jobs with nothing but determination and stubbornness. And maybe, just maybe, they'd uncover something remarkable buried under all that grime. Something worth saving. Day 1 started with skepticism and a whole lot of doubt. Jake's volunteer team stood at the entrance to the lower levels, staring at the absolute mountain of equipment they'd hauled down in 3 trips using the cargo elevator. There were 7 of them in total. Mike from engineering, a stocky guy with 20 years of experience fixing everything from coffee makers to fusion reactors. Amy and Tyler from the mining crew, both tough as nails and used to hard physical labor in dangerous conditions. Rachel from medical, who'd volunteered despite admitting she had no idea how to treat a 3,000-year-old alien dragon. And 3 maintenance workers named Dan, Kyle, and Lisa who'd signed up because, as Dan put it, this is either gonna be the coolest thing we ever do or the dumbest, and either way it's a hell of a story. The pile of equipment looked intimidating even to Jake. Industrial pressure washers, chemical degreaser tanks, pneumatic hammers, scaffolding sections, medical supplies, protective gear, and about 50 other items they'd scrounged from various departments. Boss, Mike said slowly, scratching his head as he looked from the equipment to the massive chamber beyond, that thing is huge. Like really huge. This is gonna take forever. Yep, Jake agreed cheerfully, strapping on his work gloves. Good thing we've got time. And good thing Beth approved overtime pay. Amy snorted. We're gonna need it. I'm thinking weeks, maybe months. Then we better get started, Jake said, hefting a pressure washer tank onto his shoulder. Zrakas watched them approach with wary confusion, his massive eyes tracking each human as they set up their equipment around him. In 3,000 years, no one had ever come to him with kindness. The few times anyone had ventured into the lower levels, they'd taken one look at him and fled in terror. But these humans were different. They were unpacking tools and discussing strategy, treating this like any other job. When Jake explained the plan in detail, standing right in front of the dragon's massive head without a hint of fear, Zerkos let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Dust puffed out of his nostrils. You wish to clean me? The concept seemed so absurd that the translator struggled to convey his tone. This is your purpose here? That's the idea, Jake confirmed. Why? The dragon's voice held genuine bewilderment. Why would you do this? Because you deserve better than this. Jake gestured to his team, who were now pulling on protective gear and safety goggles. We're here to help. That's all. No catch, no hidden agenda. Just help. The dragon's ancient eyes studied each human face carefully, as if trying to understand what kind of creatures would voluntarily choose to do this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he lowered his massive head until it rested on the ground in front of Jake. Very well. I do not understand you, human Jake. But I will permit this. Please, be careful. I have not felt touch without pain in longer than I can remember. They started with the head, figuring it would be the easiest place to work and would let Zerkos see what they were doing. Amy operated the industrial pressure washer, starting with the lowest setting to test how the dragon's hide would react. The water sprayed out in a concentrated stream, cutting through layers of grime. Tyler worked alongside her with a pneumatic hammer, carefully chipping away at the worst of the mineral buildup, the thick crust that had formed where water had dripped for centuries and evaporated, leaving behind stone-like deposits. Rachel cataloged every infection site she found, taking photos and notes, comparing what she saw to the limited medical data they had on reptilian species. She had no formal training in alien biology, but she was smart and observant, and she figured basic wound care was universal. The others hauled away buckets of debris and filth, establishing a rotation system so no one got too exhausted. It was disgusting work, the kind that made your stomach turn. 3,000 years of accumulated grime released smells that made even the tough miners gag and step back for fresh air. There were layers of fungus, bacterial mats that had probably been growing since before humans had discovered fire, mineral deposits that had to be dissolved with harsh chemicals, and things they couldn't even identify but definitely didn't want to think too hard about. I've seen worse, Amy muttered unconvincingly, spraying down another section while breathing through her mouth. Remember that sewage breach in Sector 7? Don't remind me, Tyler groaned, his face green behind his protective mask. I had nightmares for weeks. At least that only smelled bad, Lisa added, dumping another bucket of sludge into the waste container. This stuff is like historically bad. This is ancient bad. Bad that's been aging like the world's worst wine. Despite the conditions, nobody quit. That was the thing about humans that the other species never quite understood. Once they committed to something, once they decided something was worth doing, they were stubborn as hell about seeing it through. By the end of day 1, after 8 hours of backbreaking work, they'd cleaned roughly 2 square meters of dragon. It didn't sound like much, and looking at the vast expanse of Zerkos's body that still needed cleaning, it felt like they'd barely made a dent. But Zerkos's head was beginning to show hints of white beneath the gray. Just hints, just small patches, but it was there. See? Jake said, pointing at one of the cleaned areas. Progress. Real, actual progress. The dragon rumbled, a deep sound that vibrated through the chamber floor. It was the first sound of contentment he'd made in centuries, maybe millennia. It feels strange. I had forgotten what it was like to feel clean. Even this small amount. Day 14 brought the first real breakthrough. They'd worked their way down the dragon's neck, establishing a rhythm and routine. They knew which chemicals worked best, how much pressure the scales could handle, where the infections were worst. They'd become efficient, a well-oiled machine of human determination. They were starting on the chest area when Lisa's pressure washer hit a particularly thick patch of corrosion. She'd been working on it for 10 minutes, gradually increasing the pressure. Then suddenly, the grime washed away in a sheet, and what lay beneath made her gasp. Jake, she called out, her voice high with excitement. You need to see this. Everyone get over here. The team gathered around, and even Zerkos craned his neck to try to see what the commotion was about. Where they'd cleaned, the scales didn't just look white. They gleamed like polished ivory, and they shimmered with an inner luminescence, like moonlight reflecting off fresh snow. It was beautiful, almost magical. Well, I'll be damned, Mike whispered, reaching out to touch the clean scales with a reverent finger. It's not gray at all. You're not gray. Zerkos shifted, his massive body moving for the first time in days as he tried to see. What have you found? What do you see? You're white, Rachel said, her voice filled with wonder. She'd seen a lot of strange things working medical on a space station, but this was something else entirely. Pure white. You're beautiful. The dragon fell completely silent. The translator picked up nothing, not even breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, his voice came through thick with emotion that transcended species and language. I had forgotten. I had forgotten what I looked like. What I truly am. That night, as the team rested against the clean section of the dragon's side, eating their packed dinners and drinking coffee from thermoses, Zrakas spoke. Really spoke for the first time. He told them of the ancient wars, of civilizations that had risen and fallen. Of the people he'd sworn to protect, their names and faces, their children and their hopes. Of watching the last of his oathkeepers die of old age while he remained, bound by duty and unable to follow them into whatever came after. Jake listened quietly, passing around coffee and sandwiches to his crew. Nobody spoke, nobody interrupted. They just listened to this ancient being share 3,000 years of loneliness. And when the dragon's voice cracked with emotion, when the weight of that isolation became almost too much to bear, Jake simply reached out and placed his hand on the clean white scales and said, "You're not alone anymore." It was a simple statement, just 5 words. But to Zrakas those words meant everything. Day 34 arrived with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The team had been working nearly non-stop for over a month, taking only 1 day off per week to rest and recover. Their hands were calloused, their backs ached, and they'd gone through more industrial cleaner than the station typically used in a year. But they were almost done. Almost. The last section of grime came away under Amy's expert handling of the chemical bath. She'd become something of an artist with the pressure washer over the past month, knowing exactly which angle to spray from, how much pressure to use, which chemicals worked best on different types of buildup. This final section, a particularly stubborn patch near the base of Zrakas's tail, surrendered to her skill, revealing more of those stunning white scales underneath. Mike and Tyler carefully removed the scaffolding they'd built around the dragon's wings. That had been the trickiest part of the whole job. The wings were massive, 30 meters from tip to tip, but the membranes were delicate, almost paper-thin in places. They'd spent 3 full days just on the wings, working with brushes soft enough for a baby's skin, using specially formulated solutions that Rachel had mixed up after consulting with every xenobiologist she could get on a call. Rachel applied the final bandage to the last treated infection site, a nasty one that had been buried deep in the fold where the dragon's foreleg met his body. It had taken 2 weeks of careful treatment, daily cleaning and medication, but it was finally healed. She stepped back, tucking her medical kit under her arm, and nodded to Jake. The moment had come. Jake looked at his team, saw the exhaustion and pride on their faces, and felt something swell in his chest. These people had given everything to this project. They'd worked harder than he'd had any right to ask. And now they were about to see the result. "Okay, Zrakas," Jake said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Stand up." The entire team held their breath. Even the air in the chamber seemed to go still. Slowly, so slowly, Zrakas began to move. His legs, which had been locked in position for so long that they'd practically fused to the floor, straightened. For the first time in centuries, maybe millennia, joints that no longer screamed in agony began to work the way they were meant to. There was no grinding of bone on bone, no cracking of calcified tissue. Just smooth, natural movement. The dragon rose. His head lifted toward the ceiling, his neck extending to its full length. His chest expanded as he took the deepest breath he'd taken in 3,000 years. His legs, powerful and thick with muscle that had atrophied but not died, supported his weight easily. And then, in a moment that made Lisa gasp out loud, his wings unfurled. They spread out like sails catching wind, those delicate membranes that the team had so carefully cleaned and repaired. They stretched 30 meters tip to tip, translucent white with veins of silver running through them like lightning frozen in ice. The light from their work lamps shone through the membranes, casting ethereal shadows on the chamber walls. The dragon was magnificent. His scales gleamed like polished alabaster, each one catching the light and reflecting it with a pearlescent sheen that seemed to glow from within. His body was massive but elegant, powerful but graceful. His horns, which they'd thought were broken stumps under all that grime, were revealed as elegant spirals of ivory that curved back from his head like a crown. Lisa started crying, tears streaming down her face as she stared up at this creature they'd brought back from the edge of forgotten existence. Tyler let out a whoop of joy, pumping his fist in the air. Mike just stood there, mouth hanging open, completely unable to speak or process what he was seeing. Dan, Kyle, and Rachel huddled together, grinning like idiots. Zrakas looked down at himself, turning his head to see his body, his wings, his scales. Then he looked at his reflection in the polished metal floor panels they'd installed during the cleaning process. He stared at that reflection for a long time, not moving, barely breathing. For the first time in 3,000 years he saw himself as he truly was. The dragon's tears fell like rain, huge droplets splashing on the clean floor with sounds like breaking glass. They kept falling, a steady stream as 3 millennia of grief and isolation poured out. I had forgotten, he whispered, his voice breaking. I had forgotten who I was. What I was. I had forgotten that I was ever anything but the monster in the dark. Jake walked up slowly, carefully, and placed his hand on the dragon's foreleg. The same spot he'd touched on day one, when Zerkas had been buried in grime and they'd had no idea what they'd find underneath. The scales were warm under his palm, smooth and clean. You're the same guy, Jake said simply. We just cleaned you up. You were always this. The grime didn't change who you were. But Zerkas shook his massive head, looking down at the small human with eyes that now sparkled with life and clarity. No, human Jake. You have done more than clean. You have reminded me that I am more than my duty. More than a lock on a vault. More than a warning to keep others away. His voice grew stronger. You have reminded me that I am a person. A living being worthy of care and compassion. He looked around at the 7 humans who had spent over a month caring for him, who had touched him with gentleness, who had spoken to him with respect, who had seen past the monster to the person underneath. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. All of you. Thank you for giving me back myself. You're welcome, Amy said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of grease on her cheek. Now you've got to promise to keep yourself clean. We're leaving you maintenance supplies, instructions, everything you need. Don't let yourself get like that again. The dragon let out a sound that might have been a laugh, warm and genuine. I promise. I swear it. But as the team began packing up their equipment, coiling hoses and breaking down the remaining scaffolding, Zerkas's joy visibly faded. His wings folded back against his body. His head lowered. He looked toward the vault door, that massive sealed portal he'd been guarding for so long, and the reality of his situation settled back over him like a heavy cloak. He would return to the darkness. Alone again. The team would leave, go back to their lives, and he would remain. And this time, knowing what he was missing, knowing what companionship and kindness felt like, would make the isolation so much worse. The loneliness would be unbearable now. Jake saw the change in the dragon's demeanor immediately. He'd gotten good at reading Zerkas over the past month. What's wrong? Nothing, my friend. The dragon's voice was carefully neutral. I must return to my duty. To my post. This has been wonderful. But it must end. What if? Jake said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. What if you didn't? The proposal took 6 weeks to approve, and they were the longest 6 weeks of Jake's life. He'd submitted his idea to Beth the day after they'd finished cleaning Zerkas, barely able to sleep that night as the plan formed in his mind. Beth had looked at him like he was crazy, which was fair because the idea was ambitious to the point of being ridiculous. But she'd also seen the footage that every member of the team had recorded on their personal devices. She'd seen the transformation. And more importantly, she'd seen how it had affected not just Zerkas, but the entire station. Word had spread. Somehow, despite Jake's team trying to keep things quiet, footage of the cleaning process had leaked onto the Galactic network. Someone, probably Kyle who was always recording everything, had uploaded clips to a public forum. Within days, it had gone viral across hundreds of worlds and dozens of species. Billions had watched the humans care for the forgotten guardian. They'd watched Amy spray away centuries of grime. They'd watched Rachel treat infected wounds with gentle hands. They'd watched Jake sit and talk with Zerkas during breaks, sharing stories and coffee. And they'd watched the final moment when the dragon stood up, magnificent and reborn. The story had captured something that transcended species and culture. Here were humans showing compassion to a creature everyone else had abandoned. No ulterior motive. No grand plan. Just basic decency and kindness. Jake stood before the Galactic Consortium Council via holographic link, more nervous than he'd ever been in his life. The council chamber was intimidating even through a hologram, filled with representatives from 50 different species, all of them powerful and important and way above his pay grade. Behind him, on a massive screen, footage of the cleaning process played on loop. He'd edited it himself, staying up late to put together the most compelling version of the story he could manage. The vault contains historical records of 17 extinct civilizations, Jake explained, trying to keep his voice steady. Zerkas has guarded them faithfully for 3 millennia. He's never failed in his duty, never abandoned his post, even when everyone abandoned him. But guarding doesn't mean hiding. It doesn't mean locking knowledge away where no one can benefit from it. He pulled up the architectural plans he'd worked on with Mike, showing detailed schematics of the proposed renovation. We propose converting the lower levels into a museum and research facility. The artifacts would be preserved, properly stored in climate-controlled environments, studied by scholars and shared with the public. And Zrakas would remain their guardian, but as a curator and teacher rather than a lock on a door. The council debated for hours. Jake stood there, answering questions, defending his proposal, explaining the costs and benefits. Some representatives were enthusiastic, particularly after seeing the public response to the story. Others were skeptical, worried about the cost, concerned about disturbing ancient protocols. But the public pressure was immense. The story of the Pale Sage, as people had started calling Zrakas, and the humans who'd shown him kindness had captured hearts across hundreds of worlds. Petitions flooded in supporting the proposal. News outlets ran stories about forgotten guardians on other stations, sparking conversations about duty and compassion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the council voted. The holographic display showed the results: 47 in favor, 3 against. The proposal passed. Jake nearly collapsed with relief. Beth, watching from beside him in the conference room, actually hugged him, something she'd never done before. 6 months later, after the fastest construction project Jake had ever seen, the Grand Historical Archive of Station Kepler 9 opened its doors to the public. The transformation was stunning. The lower levels, once dark and abandoned, now gleamed with light and life. Climate-controlled galleries housed priceless artifacts behind protective displays. Holographic exhibits told the stories of lost civilizations, their art and culture and history preserved for future generations. Interactive displays let visitors explore ancient texts and recordings. Research labs gave scholars access to materials they'd only dreamed of studying. And at the center of it all, in a massive chamber that had been completely renovated with gleaming floors and soft lighting, stood Zrakas. His scales were immaculate, maintained by a permanent care staff that included all 7 members of the original cleaning crew. They'd all transferred to new positions specifically created for the archive. Amy headed up maintenance. Rachel ran the medical monitoring program. Mike managed the facility systems. The others handled various aspects of day-to-day operations. But the real magic happened when Zrakas spoke. His voice, once a painful rasp barely understandable through the translator, now resonated clearly through the galleries as he gave lectures to scholars, students, and tourists from across the galaxy. He spoke of ancient wars and forgotten technologies, of civilizations that had reached heights humanity hadn't yet achieved, of lessons learned and lost. Jake visited on opening day, wearing his best suit for the ceremony. He'd been invited as the guest of honor, though he tried to decline. Beth had insisted, and Jake had learned not to argue with her when she used that particular tone. The place was packed. Thousands had come for the grand opening, representatives from dozens of worlds, media outlets, curious tourists, and scholars who'd traveled across the galaxy for this opportunity. Zrakas spotted Jake immediately in the crowd and lowered his great head in greeting, his eyes bright with recognition and warmth. "Human Jake, you came. Wouldn't miss it," Jake grinned, reaching up to touch the dragon's snout. "You look good." "Happy. I am." The dragon's eyes sparkled with life that had been completely absent 3,000 years of darkness. "I have purpose beyond mere existence. I have companions who visit me daily. I have students eager to learn. I have hope for the future." He paused, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "I have friends." A group of young Luxari students approached nervously, their crystalline bodies chiming with excitement. They asked Zrakas questions about the ancient war period, about technologies their civilization had long forgotten. The dragon answered with patience and genuine enthusiasm, his whole being radiating joy as he shared knowledge he'd kept locked away for so long. Beth Carter, officially the station administrator now after a promotion, stood beside Jake watching the scene. "You know, the consortium is calling this the Bennett Protocol now? They've created new guidelines for checking on all ancient guardians and isolated workers across the galaxy. Mandatory wellness checks, psychological support, the works." "Good," Jake said, watching Zrakas interact with the students. "Nobody should be left alone like that. Not for 3 years, let alone 3,000. You started something, Jake. Humans showing that compassion isn't weakness or foolishness. That it's actually strength. That caring about others makes us better, not worse." Jake shrugged in his characteristic way, uncomfortable with the praise. "We just gave a guy a bath. Everyone deserves basic dignity, doesn't matter if they're human or alien or a 3,000-year-old dragon. It's not complicated." As Beth walked away to handle official duties and give speeches to important people, Jake stayed a moment longer. Zerkas was surrounded by admirers now, scholars hanging on his every word about civilizations they'd only read about in fragments, children staring up in awe at this magnificent creature. The dragon caught Jake's eye across the crowded room and nodded, a small gesture of gratitude that needed no translation, no words, nothing but the understanding between two friends. Jake nodded back and quietly headed for the exit. Tomorrow he had a mining operation to run, equipment to maintain, 1,000 mundane tasks that needed his attention. But tonight, walking through the station's corridors toward his quarters, he'd sleep well. Because sometimes the most heroic thing a human could do was simply treat someone with kindness. Even if that someone was a 3,000-year-old dragon who just needed a bath.